brokerage firm. And in 2015, in compliance with licensing regulations, he launched Kosmont Transaction Services as an SEC MSRB registered municipal financial authority firm. Mr. Kosmont's 40-year career encompasses public-private financial structuring, negotiation, development, and management of real estate and public finance transactions exceeding $12 billion. In addition to Larry Kosmont, we also have Joe Dieguez, who's a senior vice president from Kosmont Companies. Joseph Dieguez is a senior vice president, as I mentioned, serving public and private sector clients primarily through market and economic analyses, strategic planning, real estate development advice. His recent work includes special tax increment financing implementation, including enhanced infrastructure financing districts and community revitalization investment authorities, as well as market supply and demand analysis, fiscal impact and economic benefit studies, financial feasibility and development pro forma evaluation, and property reuse strategies for municipalities, as well as real estate investment and development firms and multiple Fortune 500 clients. So again, thank you everyone for joining this session. I think it will be very informative, and I'll go ahead and pass it off to Larry.
So Bobby, are you sharing the screen or is that how we're doing it? Yep. Well, good. Here we go. All right, well, good afternoon, and thank you, Kimberly and Kevin and all our good friends and associates at SCAG. SCAG has been a leader in so many of the key issues of related to economic development planning and land use strategies. This presentation today is meant to induce a conversation amongst all of us that relates to the fundamentals of how a community can restructure, retool, revitalize its local economy after this COVID-19 sort of economic meltdown that we're going through. And it is a significant change in economic priorities for the private sector, which means that if you're in the economic development business, it's a substantial shift for you as a public agency. And so to the extent that some of you are on the private side or on the public side, this presentation is really meant to engage the intersection of those two disciplines in a go-forward economic development strategy. Now, let me move to the next slide. So just by way of background, Kosmont performs three major services for public agencies and private sector investors and developers: economic development, real estate, and public finance. So we tend to look at the world very transactionally. Next slide. That's our 1-minute commercial. So to the extent that we are living in a snapshot of a global crisis and that is distilling down to the local level, the presentation really is geared at helping particularly city public agency officials figure out how to shift from the day-to-day exigencies of public health and social need, which is your first immediate chapter in a global crisis that has local impacts, and the need to relieve economic pressure, which comes from things like short-term economic loans or opening streets, in this case, opening public space to private use. But it quickly moves to recovery, right? So response, relief, recovery. Recovery is really where this economic development dialogue comes in, because there is as soon as you get through the chapter of chaos, which may last longer than you would like in a pandemic like this, the reality is the true lengthy endeavor will be recovery, because the damage is broad. In certain cases, in certain segments of the economy, it's very deep, and it has a very meaningful impact in terms of tax revenues, and most importantly, figuring out where you take your economic development resources and place them going forward in a changed economy. Next slide. So part of this is figuring out, where the constituent base is going to feel comfortable and confident in engaging in private sector activity again. I mean, we have some really interesting studies that show 60 to 70% of the population not comfortable in, let's see, I just lost my screen here. Here we go. Not comfortable in getting on an airplane for 6 or more months. Hotel rooms, 3 to 6 months. And the reality is, until we can figure out what that confidence level is, some of it's going to come from a vaccine, some of it's going to come from practice, and really the acceptability of practices, then going forward for us in the public sector and in the private sector is going to be a function of balancing these components, information, safety, cleanliness, health and wellness, and then moving forward, reconfiguration of our society from an investment and operational perspective, and support through planning and adoption by the public sector to support those activities. Next slide. So what we like to do, Kosmont advises almost 60 or 70 public agencies up and down the state, and literally hundreds of developers. We've been in business 33 years. We've been in this transactional mode for quite a while. And there's a big difference between the activities of what I'll call generically today versus tomorrow. And we want to focus mostly on tomorrow in this conversation. But today, city managers and mayors are really shepherding the issues of cash flow management and revenue projections, trying to maximize their return, minimize their outflow. They're going after immediate grants that can help do that. They're looking at flexible zoning and permitting that have fast adaptation and results that can help restaurants or retailers or hotels and other businesses sort of reconvene. And in doing that, they have to work closely with local stakeholders. The case for tomorrow is much different, right? There, it's a question of how do you, in the first two, how do you prioritize your projects and your procedures so that you can figure out how to underwrite private investment and bring it back in a way that's going to generate the taxes that you've lost, So how do you leverage your grant funds and your assets to induce private sector investment to the extent that's possible? One unique feature of this particular pandemic is that it's taking place in a very ultra low interest rate environment that was actually expanded in terms of opportunity by the COVID-19 Emergency Relief Act and all of the CARES Act, which basically gives cities the opportunity to refund debt at extraordinarily low rates. We just finished, and I'll talk about a little bit later, a $100 million pension obligation fund, which funded pension obligation bond for the city of Carson, which funded this morning, about 6 hours ago, at all-in interest rates of 3.5% or less, frankly, and PERS charges them 7% for that same carry. So they basically cut their debt in half, or the cost of their debt in half. Most importantly, as pertaining to this conversation, public sector has to figure out how to focus on what I call blended use projects that meet the changing residential and commercial priorities of the private sector. We have to make and induce investments for a sustained recovery. And the truth of it is that I can best characterize it this way. Just 8 months ago, we said to our clients that entertainment, that athletics, that sports entertainment was a draw for retail. And yesterday or earlier this week, 24-hour fitness closed over 100 stores. I mean, the changes are cataclysmic when you've sort of banked on various components of a economic development strategy that just don't even exist and won't exist going forward. And if they reemerge, they'll be different. Next slide. So here's what we call the land use revolution, because in a nutshell, it is hard to paint this picture on one slide, but it really is emblematic of the challenge that we all face. And that is, you can't really put your pulse on the right solution because the solutions are changing and have changed and continue to change. So in every possible product type, right? I call product types development product types. That's what we mean. So retail, clearly the COVID-19 has accelerated the online integrity of sales as opposed to in person. Clearly it's done that, but it's also now shifted how experience is different. We now say that outdoors is a new anchor, which was not the case just a little while ago. And of course, health and wellness would be a big part of retail services. industrial, there's not a stronger category out there for investment than warehouse and logistics. And we have what we call a doorstep economy now, where the idea is to deliver as quickly as you can. And that's sort of the loop that's stepped around retail. So industrial is accelerating because it needs to be more and more infill. That's a change. A lot of our communities have not really appreciated the benefits of industrial development. Well, in a online demand economy, infill industrial warehouse and logistics is a key element. Hospitality is entirely reshuffling, and the schism there will be business versus leisure. It will take leisure, destination hotels to come. It will take much longer for those to come back in terms of consumer confidence than functional business travel. And so we could see hospitality converting to other uses. Office, the balance of office, what we call the 6-foot space office, and I think the redeployment of closed offices versus just open space, the challenge of co-working and the work from home factor, all key elements in changing the viability of that product. And then finally, probably the other star in terms of this land use revolution really relates to residential, which is changing also, moving from higher density to medium, what I call suburban urban sort of ratios or density. The advent of the reemergence of the single family house as a priority even for former urban core residents is really something that is occurring. So next slide. So that's, for us, the land use revolution still means moving land uses, moving forward and supporting land uses with conclusions or projects that do two things. One is they create a place, but now the place has to be about blended uses, and they are not about really just a space, a large space anymore. Shopping malls, as we'll show you, are really going to go through an entire reshuffling of how they're used. So the focus of public investment in this digital economy in post-COVID is really much more about place with a greater integration of outdoors and indoors. Next slide. The state, on the other hand, is a driver in the equation of land use as well. It's not just the post-COVID economy that drives us to things like sustainability and mobility and housing. The state's been there. And on the next slide, you'll see that even that shift is underway. In fact, a lot of the conversation about ultra density has been a little bit muted this year, certainly because the legislative slate and agenda is packed with COVID-19 and budget issues. But even the conversations such as under SB 1385, where this bill would in fact enable by right residential development on zoned commercial, office, and retail spaces. This is an opportunity that is certainly accelerated post-COVID because we have clearly hundreds of large-scale shopping centers that will never really act as a shopping center anymore. They just can't. The market won't support the level of retail space they currently accommodate, whether it's a big box or the small space. I like to say this, that pre-COVID, the big box, the Macy's, the JCPenney's, the Sears of the world were already being challenged by the internet. Post-COVID, the small space in the middle of that mall also really faces extinction. And so that combination really makes something like SB 1385 a major value proposition. Next slide, please. So the various approaches that we have to work with cities is, for us, is really depicted on this slide. We call these our post-COVID economic development approaches. And the idea is that cities have now, we think this is sort of the menu of tools and approaches that they can use in a post-COVID environment. One, certainly starting on the left with emergency funding sources, but there are other tools like flexible land use and zoning and reconsidering parking ratios, reimagining retail centers and hotels for new uses, using zoning as currency instead of giving away zoning in the specific plan as of right, collecting that zoning and then doling it out on a project-specific basis through a development agreement. To the extent that you give up sales tax revenue, you can replace it through a development agreement as an in lieu payment or a payment in lieu of taxes, a pilot payment. Opportunity zones still very usable in many communities. And I think that once these investors start to figure out where the real deals will be in the next year, because everyone's on the sideline in the investment community. I can tell you this, that it's not that there isn't a ton of investment capital out there, which is very good news for cities and counties looking to revitalize. It's just that they don't want to take the leap yet because they don't know where the bargains are going to be. So programs like opportunity zones are now taking a back seat to capital that's looking to opportunistic investments that come out of the sort of the COVID downfall, if you will. Using special districts and tax increment financing is a key part of these strategies. We could talk about that in a little bit. Using your land sales, there are still many, many cities that have hundreds of properties that were meant to be sold post the redevelopment dissolution, still hasn't happened. So public land as a resource for funding or as a contribution to a public-private transaction, either through a sale or a ground lease, is a major approach that can be had. And I already talked about refinancing and restructuring debt. And as I say, that is an opportunity to at least create liquidity and cash flow, which helps fund some of the other stuff that we've talked about. Next slide. So just in a nutshell, the way we look at this in terms of case studies, and this would help support the conversation that we're going to have here, is that if you look at land use as a reimagination program, I'm going to show you that in a minute, you can see what that could look like. If you look at special districts as a tool, EIFD, CREA, CFDs, these are all infrastructure financing tools that can help cities engage the private sector in a post-COVID world and make those economies work more prolifically. I talked about using zoning as currency. When you create a specific plan in a community post-COVID, you want to capture that additional density in something we call development opportunity reserve and dole that out on a project-by-project basis in exchange for public amenities and infrastructure. To the extent that to the right, you're moving forward with a use that used to generate sales tax, and to the extent that you can negotiate a development agreement for a replacement blended use, if you can get an equivalent tax revenue flow out of that transaction through a development agreement, we call that sales tax assessment revenue, or STAR. We create those mechanisms as part of a development agreement for a blended use project. And to the extent that you can sell assets and finance using low interest rates, all of these case studies that we'll show you use these tools, and they're very prolific and they can be very effective, even though we're really facing a very changed economy. Next slide. The one that I think stands out from Kosmont's perspective, and again, we're in the middle of literally 100 public-private transactions up and down the state. This is emblematic of where 1385 was speaking to, that SB 1385. This is the Laguna Hills Mall. It was built in 1973. 3 anchors that are on life support: Sears, JCPenney, and Macy's. And now the difference pre-COVID, that already was the case pre-COVID. The difference is in the blue, post-COVID, that enclosed retail of 250,000 square feet is now on life support. So, you know, these centers have no future in this world the way they are. They just don't. They're parking crossed by easements. They're owned by the shopping center major anchors like JCPenney and Sears and Macy's. So the parking's controlled. The tenants on the interior are extinguishing themselves by the day. It's a long list of fatalities. Some of them are just going to downsize. Some of them are going to just go away, and there'll be some new ones, but it won't fill that 300,000 square feet. It's likely to be 10% of that, or 20%. Next slide. So what has to happen is that if I can move that forward, what has to happen is that in a post-COVID world, using those tools that we're talking about, creating a special district, overlaying a plan that brings density and uses together in a way that speaks to private investment, more residential, integration of outdoors. There will be hotel that's not going to go away. It's just going to be a different kind of product. It might be extended stay. The shops may be much different, fewer, more service-oriented, and the office is likely to be less dense and more integrated with the outdoors and based on technology. This is a project we happen to be working on, but there's 100 or more of these throughout the state that are really the best down payment to new housing that the state can make by sort of working with localities to make sure that zoning and financial tools are available to retool these sites, because they just can't exist the way they are. So next slide, I think I'll hand over to Joe Dieguez, who will have a couple more case studies that he can go through.
Yeah, thank you. So sales tax assessment revenue, or STAR, is one of those sort of planning-oriented tools that Larry was talking about. At its simplest level, it's sort of a revenue replacement and zoning tool where you're essentially trying to right size a community benefit contribution for a rezone. The case for Jurupa Valley was you've got declining development interest in your sort of traditional retail and the sales tax that comes from it, right? Common story. Meanwhile, increasing demand for non-sales tax generating uses like residential and warehouse industrial. And oftentimes, as in the case of Jurupa Valley, you're seeing that demand and interest on sites that are zoned and were originally targeted for the more traditional type retail development. So the STAR analysis in this case is kind of twofold. From the public sector perspective, a little bit of a reality check. What could the city, the community actually expect? At what point in the future, in terms of traditional retail development and sales, given demographics, retail sales, leakage trends, and just economic trends in consumer spending? And on the private sector side, what can this non-sales tax generating project actually afford to contribute in the form of some sort of one-time or ongoing community benefit contribution in exchange for that rezone? So in the case of Jurupa Valley, it was a negotiation where we ended up actually with both components, a one-time and ongoing community benefit contribution that the project could bear financial feasibility-wise, but that also compensated the city for a rezone from its perspective that was memorialized in a development agreement. Really a win-win. Next slide, please. Development Opportunity Reserve, or DOR, is another really planning-oriented tool that Larry touched on. This case study is from a small Santa Barbara city called Buellton, where they really manufactured some new density that the community was willing to accept, but they didn't automatically upzone and allocate that density to the parcels within the district. Why the heck not? Well, in that situation, you were dealing with a bunch of recalcitrant landowners that really had no interest in moving forward with actual development. And an automatic upzone would essentially just increase their asking price to sell the properties. In the DOR framework, the city holds on to that additional density as opposed to allocating it automatically. And it holds that density in this Development Opportunity Reserve and only allocates or distributes that density, as Larry said, for projects that actually deliver on a preset menu of community benefits, things like offsite infrastructure contributions, trails, public restrooms in this specific case, and similar to the STAR program, really gets memorialized on a project by project basis in the form of a development agreement. So another good case study there, and we're seeing it more and more common as well. Next slide, please. Special districts are becoming more and more commonplace now. One of the best examples is a project that SCAG was intricately involved in, and that's the City of Placentia, County of Orange Enhanced Infrastructure Financing District. Tax increment financing here, where you've got the first city and county partnership in the state in one of these districts, where each of those entities is contributing some portion of their future property tax increment to pay for some really catalytic first mile, last mile infrastructure around the forthcoming Metrolink station. Very TOD oriented, over 300 acres. And what's very topical here post-COVID, the plan all along was to leverage that tax increment in terms of some form of financing in the future, but also in parallel to pursue some grant funding. And this district is now, we're helping them pursue EDA CARES Act grant funding with this special multi-jurisdictional special purpose entity application through the EIFD, with really a higher level of priority and eligibility as a special purpose entity. It's multi-jurisdictional, and it's only authorized, to do two things: infrastructure and affordable housing. and infrastructure in the Placentia's case. So a real advantageous approach of using the special district, not only for the tax increment, but to elevate the eligibility for grant funding. Next slide, please. So Laverne, we want to touch on, folks may be familiar with Laverne as the first EIFD in the SCAG region, first in LA County, also TOD oriented around the forthcoming Gold Line station. What I wanted to touch on here is that many communities who are looking at these tax increment tools, like Enhanced Infrastructure Financing District, have seen that rules have changed recently. This is one where the city formed 2017, and it's only January of this year, 2020, that the County of Los Angeles finally adopted a resolution to partner. So it's great that it's another city-county partnership. One of the challenges here, as I said, is that there are new rules to the game. Assembly Bill 116, effective January 1 of this year, changed the rules and the requirements for the formation of districts and the authorization to issue debt. So Laverne and County of LA are essentially together reauthorizing this EIFD under these post-AB 116 rules, while also achieving approval to issue debt through this new public hearing process. This is sort of in comparison to the old 55% voter approval requirement. So this will be relevant for a lot of districts now, communities looking to form these districts, understanding that the rules have changed for formation and issuance of debt. Next slide, please. And then lastly, on special district side, the list is growing, right? Over 36 of these going on statewide, many in the SCAG region, but all across the state. And we've said it before, we'll say it again. When you've seen one EIFB, you've seen only one. These vary drastically from inland to coastal, urban to rural, the types of infrastructure being targeted from your more traditional water, roadway, maybe transit supportive infrastructure, to a lot more these days of your sort of climate adaptation improvements and resiliency to things like sea level rise and fire hazards, which have all now been pointed out explicitly as eligible expenditures. So we think these will become more and more commonplace, and we'll certainly keep folks updated. So we can talk about all that more in Q&A. I'm going to pass it back to Larry now to talk about some more of the finance-oriented tools.
Yeah, and I would say that in terms of the EIFDs, SCAG has been a leader in terms of creating pilot project funds for communities in their service area to really explore TOD and housing EIFDs and job-oriented EIFDs. The Kosmont's had the privilege of working with SCAG, and it's really made a difference in a number of these communities. So I think this program will continue to be very prolific for California, especially in a post-COVID economy. Next slide. So I talked about this. This is so critical. I mean, in California, the 500 or so cities that exist, they are suffering under just a sea of pension obligation debt, nearly $300 million. That doesn't include the state's unfunded liabilities. And it's crippling. So you have these communities that have lost hotel and sales tax immediately post-COVID. They're having trouble balancing their budget, and they have essentially hundreds of millions of dollars. Carson, which is not a huge city, and certainly not a wealthy city, had $108 million in unfunded liabilities owed to PERS. And PERS charges them 7% as the carry cost for the deficiency in investment performance that they have had over the years. So in other words, it's like having your own investment counselor saying, I lost your money, I need more, and I'm going to charge you interest for the money I've lost. It's kind of like that. It's the most incredible system. Well, what's most incredible now is that there is the ability to swap out this very expensive debt at 7%. Just as I said this morning, you can see on the bottom left bullet 3, we sold 108.2 million in POBs at less than 3.5% interest, cutting that carry cost for Carson in half. That's a $40 million budget improvement. I mean, that is over the period of time of that loan, $2 to $3 million a year in savings. And it's that kind of foresight on the leadership of the Carson City Council and city manager and staff to really go forward and get this done, which will give them some resources in a post-COVID world, one, to balance their budget, and then move forward year by year using those savings to shore up their ability to invest in their community. They're just replacing existing debt. They owe it anyway. Next slide. So just in action, you can see these are tools for many of you that you may be seeing some of these tools for the first time, but they're not unusual. We're doing these transactions all the time, whether it's this land use reimagination of blended uses, like we talked about in Laguna Hills, or development opportunity reserve, or sales tax assessment revenue, special districts, using P3s and refinanced bonds are all strategies that Kosmont has deployed pre-COVID and will deploy even more post-COVID. Next slide. And to us, the key in terms of this land use revolution, which has come out of COVID, I mean, every trend in retail that was already occurring was simply accelerated by COVID. Now, hotels were just knocked on their backside. I mean, it's just totally, and so were entertainment spaces and outdoor events. These are all things that, you know, changed. But the reality is we can't rely on the old retail formulas. We won't be able to rely on the old or existing office formula. And we have to look at a blending of uses, not only for the standpoint of mobility and energy conservation and clean air, but for just investment, for the safety of our constituents and the plausibility of making productive investments on the private sector side, which generates housing, jobs, and taxes for communities. The new anchors will be residential and a reconfigured office space. The blended use integration of uses with outdoor amenity and attractions will be, I think, a key to the key to the land use highway going forward. And the world has got to feel safer about being in places, but when they are safe, they really want those places to look like a living room and to feel like they are flexible enough to engage a trip versus deploying the trip through an internet visit. That's our competition. You know, it is not only just investment in a post-COVID world, but the ability to buy most of your goods through the use of technology. The change and the balance here is to create a space that's safe and healthy, to create a place that's engaging, and to introduce uses in a blended mix that really forces a trip or compels a trip versus pushing a button at home. Next slide. The key for cities and for counties and for public agencies and for the private sector is figuring out when these uses come back. And like I say, if you look in the bottom, purple, the mall is not coming back. That's going to reform. We know that. But business travel, moving up the slide, coming back earlier than leisure travel. Restaurants coming back earlier than retail. Office somewhere in the middle. Single family apartment close in. And what's never left us, even in this COVID world, are data centers, industrial, and groceries. That's sort of the roadmap to recovery. The question is, what's the time frame for these? And that's a bigger discussion that we can't have with you today because this is a tools-oriented discussion, but it's something that is important to evaluate in terms of an economic development strategy. Next slide. I think we're just about done. So the point is that we're making is we have to pick the right strategy. What do we support to get resilience? And the emerging living trends as we see them are authentic, safe neighborhoods with mid-density and single family as an immediate response. That could change. Hotels that focus on business and local travel, and hotels that can retool to other uses. Retail and industrial coming to a blend. We see a time where that middle space in that mall that we showed you in Laguna, some of that gets used for storage of goods. So there's on-site delivery for some of the smaller retail. So we're going to see sort of fulfillment become very local. It's a doorstep economy. Everybody wants the last mile to work. Everyone wants connectivity and mobility on their own terms. And so as a result, cities are going to have to embrace blending uses and outdoor amenities and figure out how to use their zoning and their spaces to combine fun, food, fitness, and fashion in a way that provides an anchor for a trip as opposed to a motivation to stay home and make the sale on Amazon and make the purchase on Amazon. Next slide. Just so wrapping it up, our inventory checklist at Kosmont for our communities is one, a very transparent and extensive assessment of what you have in the cards, what's working in your community, what's not based on COVID investment patterns. and how do you make decisions on land use that are flexible enough to change the attraction level of your community to those kinds of uses that are going to flourish in this next period of time. And while doing that, how do you capture value using planning and zoning? And how do you manage cash flow with your finance tools? And through that sort of strategic perspective, can you identify funding opportunities, whether it's EDA money for special projects or other revenue sources that you're investing in that have a return to them? And because all of those first four things are so critical, they should lead to your ability to select your best economic development opportunities and projects. Because, you know, make no mistake about it, the choices you make on the front end in a post-COVID world are very serious choices. And next slide. And so to wrap this up, we think that cities really look at the world of investment, the economic development playbook, as kind of a mix of offense and defense. You know, we can use special districts to plant the seed, even opportunity zones when they come back in favor, which will be within the next year. And we can combine that with what we call on the bottom, other OPM, other public money. So that's sort of the offense. The defense is, how do we not let land use applications sort of truncate our ability to position ourselves as a community for the future? How do we take back that, you know, sort of permission, if you will, and use it as a revenue and value capture program? So using zoning as currency, it's just a much better and more advantageous perspective. And we have tools like DOR and sales tax assessments that can do it. And finally, on the defense side, how do we get out of debt that's too expensive and create liquidity and cash flow? Or can we and do we have properties we're willing to sell or lease, either as part of a P3 project or on a standalone basis, that can create some liquidity for us? So I think Joe and I will stop there. We thank you for the time you've given us. I think we've given you a bunch of things to think about. It's sort of how we look at the world, economic development style post-COVID. And I guess I'll turn it back to Kevin or Kimberly and take it from there.
Great. Thanks, Larry and Joe. I think that was a really detailed presentation. You know, as we approach a new paradigm when it comes to COVID, it's important to understand the public financing impacts, but also the public financing tools that are on the table and the financing tools that are on the table. So at this time, I'd welcome questions from our attendees. If you guys want to go ahead and put them in the chat box, I'm happy to voice them to Larry and Joe. Give it a little bit of time. Yeah, here we go. Could you talk a little bit more about some of the challenges to scaling EIFDs in the SoCal region post-COVID?
Sure, Joe, you know, come on in on this anytime you want. So I think the challenges for EIFDs haven't changed really. The primary challenge for an EIFD is that it relies on the local cities or counties' property tax levels, and so you're sort of limited to the investment return that you can get out in EIFD because the tax increment is sort of traded on the amount or the percentage of the tax bill that your community has. So most cities in LA County, for example, have 10 cents or less. So it takes a significant amount of investment to get a good return on that. It changes when you can add other public money, the county or a special district like Metro or so on, which are allowable. But it is the, sort of the cadence of political approval that becomes, a little bit of the obstacle, whether it's pre-COVID and post-COVID. The post-COVID change, though, becomes really in making sure that the infrastructure investment that you make through your EIFD, because it's fundamentally a district to induce investment in infrastructure, which induces private investment. So that could be streets, it could be utilities, it can be a lot of different things. You can invest in a number of amenities and fundamental infrastructure. But what do you support? And that's why we focus on these antiquated, retail centers, because they cry out as a place that's in a high volume location that probably can use the overlay, if you will, to its benefit through an EIFD. But again, the primary challenge I think that we see beyond the politics and the procedure of getting multiple agencies to agree to commit your tax increment, your future tax increment to that district pursuant to the infrastructure financing plan, which is the document that gets adopted by the district. The challenge beyond getting the collaboration of local communities to get that done, even though we've been able to do it, it's always a big discussion, a significant discussion. Challenge beyond that is picking the right project in the right location. And the dynamics of that assessment has shifted post-COVID. And that's why you really have to be in tune with that checklist that we provided you toward the end. Joe, you may want to add to that.
I guess from a very practical standpoint, a difficulty in scaling this is a little bit of distraction. I think a lot of communities are in defense mode right now. And kind of just speaking to the slide that's on the screen now, it's hard to focus on offense when you're dealing with, even pre-COVID, sort of staggering pension obligations and other issues locally. So to try to focus on an offensive play, like setting up a value capture district, like tax increment financing, or otherwise, it's just hard to focus on it. But beyond that, I think we're actually seeing some improvements in the ability to scale these things with additional grant funding being made available through programs like CDBG and the EDA CARES Act grant funding through their existing economic adjustment assistance program. We're actually seeing increased availability of upfront sources of capital that are really critical in kickstarting an EIFD, which is a tax increment mechanism, right? It takes time sometimes for the tax increment to generate. The availability of some of these grant sources actually plays really well and improves the viability of these districts. So I think it can cut both ways when viewed strategically.
We have a couple other questions. Have you seen examples of housing market rate or lower pricing successfully built out in mall anchor spaces?
Yeah, so I think the answer is yes and no. I mean, we're on the front end of really retooling these malls. And so at the fringes of malls, we have seen a significant amount of housing wanting to be developed. I mean, for example, the Westfield Mall, Century City just added a significant component of housing. Sure, it's luxury housing, it's not affordable housing, but there are other parts of the state where shopping centers in excess pieces are converting to residential. This is a nascent movement. It is happening. And the reason we know it's happening is we're working with 5 or 6 communities right now, places like Buena Park, again, Laguna Hills, where we're adding through zoning hundreds of residential units as part of a revitalization strategy. I saw some of the questions, so let me kind of deal with some of those things. Number one, if you have an anchor mall, a retail center, and many cities do in California, there's several hundred actually, we've been used to getting sales tax out of those facilities. It is a very hard philosophical shift to say you're going to give up on sales tax and put in residential. So part of the obstacle is, and someone asked a great question, how do you re-engineer a shopping center or a retail center from a public perspective? And then what are the steps that it would take to get the private sector owner to respond to that? Well, here's the interesting thing. The private sector owner of these malls has to respond to it. If you look at Wall Street capitalization values, the large mall REITs have taken the biggest hit in value. You know, a great example, for example, is Macerich trading at $50 a year and a half ago. I think this morning at $9.25. They own 50 retail centers plus or minus throughout the United States. in A locations, places like Tyson's Corner in Santa Monica, the value that the capital market is giving that stock is less than the land value in California. So to me, they're already a motivated party to increase value. The issue is the community and that private owner need to come together to create that specific plan, but that enables housing. And that's where 1385 was gearing toward. Just sort of a as of right capacity to put housing in retail centers, because you have parking, you have enough open undeveloped space to make those transitions work. What you don't have is a blended use plan like the one you saw for Laguna Hills. And you don't have necessarily eye-to-eye consensus between the private sector owner and the public sector as to how to redefine that space. I think COVID changes that dialogue. I mean, because these centers don't have real commercial value without adding residential. So I think this conversation is just getting started. And I think to the extent that laws like 1385 should it be approved, and others that we're thinking about introducing can also implement or coerce the implementation of affordable housing as part of that residential conversion, that's going to be a natural conclusion as well. So my point is we're at the front end of this. This is a trend that is now accelerated post-COVID. This is part of what we think is a significant component of the land use revolution. The district tool really enables this, by the way. If you plan the reuse on a blended basis and you use a district to capture the value of the tax increment, that's a great tool to generate funds to reinvest into things like affordable housing or public amenities. I'll conclude by saying there are places like the Redondo Beach Galleria that have already approved residential pre-COVID as part of a retooling of that mall. We are going to see these more and more up and down the state.
Let's see, we have another question or a comment. One of the concerns with constraining housing costs has been for greater regulatory certainty. In other words, objective standards, by right zoning. Could you speak a little bit to that? And also, generally a comment, the use of CBAs and zoning as currency could seem at odds with cost control centers for housing.
Oh, I think it's the opposite.
Yeah.
I really do. Go ahead, Joe. Yeah. Go.
Yeah, I couldn't agree. I think it's worth spending a minute on this because it's worth it. So it may seem that way. It is quite the opposite. The issue that the zoning as currency issue actually addresses is that in many of our communities, the automatic upzone is not actually helping the housing getting built. It is, as I mentioned briefly earlier, just increasing the asking price of a landowner who truly doesn't have the intention to build a project, him or herself. What the program like the DOR program, this zoning currency program does, it sort of shifts that additional cost in a way. It's no longer increasing the asking price because that increased zoning is not available automatically. It instead enables the money that potential developer would have spent anyway for increased land price to something that can be less in terms of actual dollars, in terms of this community benefit contribution, but that while doing so is actually increasing the viability and the feasibility of that project. So the idea is instead of just paying more for land, you're building a public restroom nearby. That investment in the public restroom, just as one example, is actually increasing the attractiveness of the subject property. There's an additional community amenity now available to the residents and or commercial tenants of that project, which is increasing the feasibility of that development pro forma. So it's actually potentially reduced costs and the community benefit versus the increased land price. And that cost is really an investment that improves that project.
Yeah, I agree with that. Just as a follow-on, certainty tends to reduce the carry cost of the development project. The reason entitlements are expensive is because they're uncertain. And you're not sure how long and how much in terms of how long it'll take you to get approval, whether or not you'll have a challenge, and how much you get out of the approval in terms of density or uses. The DOR program basically says we have already committed a certain amount of density. It's here in this bucket. It's 1 million square feet. The difference is that I haven't given it to a land trust that's holding a generational property where there's not a developer at the dinner table, and they're never going to move that property forward. What I've done is I've given density to the private sector who, if entrepreneurial enough, will notice that that density is available if they're willing to take the development risk. They'll knock on the door of the owner who's passive, and they'll say, look, you know, I'll pay you X as opposed to X plus, which is what happens when you give the existing owner density. Because, and the reason I'll give you X is I still have to, as a developer, take the risk on the development application. Here's the difference. I know the density is there. The city has approved it. There's a CEQA document that's recorded the density as being acceptable. I just have to make an at-risk exchange with the city for what I need to put in to earn that density. So you can't charge me for the density because I have to go earn it. But in earning it, I have the certainty that it can be earned. That's the nuance that is so important post-COVID. We can't afford to give density away anymore through a specific plan, because we give it to the wrong private sector entities, the ones that basically either are going to put a for sale sign on it and take the value capture of the density that we gave them and move it away from the very person or the very entity we want to make the investment at a residual land value that would induce a new project. So this shifts the balance. It creates density certainty. It takes away the front end load charge of the existing passive owner. It dilutes that. And it basically enables residential to move forward with it on a much faster basis. That's really, you know, you couple that with a district tool that captures the value from that higher density investment. You basically reinvest that increment in amenities, as Joe was saying, that also accelerates the value to the developer of that density. That's the key. It's not to give it away to the existing passive landowner, but to put it in the hands of a developer that's going to add value and then further capture that value, reinvest it in a way that further induces that same developer to create a bigger, or a different, or more diverse kind of project. It's a cycle of development that we need. We don't have, you know, redevelopment agencies anymore. So this is really a combination of tax increment and land use that I think ostensibly, I grew up in a redevelopment era, we were trying to capture with redevelopment. We just don't have that facility anymore. It's not coming back. These tools are, I think, a very functional and capable equivalent to that.
So building on some of the case studies that you guys showed for adaptive reuse when it comes to regional malls, one of the questions we have, are there any good resources on visioning and repurposing traditional regional malls with anchors that are now failing?
Yeah, I think there are. I think we have worked, you know, we have had discussions with ULI, with ICSC. There are a number of workshops that we put together for various communities to reimagine retail spaces. You know, we've done it for both retail corridors and retail properties. I think you saw Laguna Hills, that's being reimagined. In Buellton, I think you saw that was a DOR example. That was a whole boulevard recharacterization and planning. We, you know, if whoever asked that question, I can take you to specific examples that we've done and others are doing that reimagine these spaces all up and down the state. These are acts of necessity. I mean, they are a little bit sidetracked because of the exigency of what we're dealing with right now. But, you know, when FEMA leaves town and things start to move back to a new normal, which it will be a new normal, these planning exercises, the combination of zoning, private sector planning, special district creation, and refinancing, those, you know, that's an ingredient. That's an ingredient list that truly can redeploy these properties. And then we've talked to SCAG and others about some other issues that exist that relate to retail centers. I said this earlier, these retail centers are embargoed by a series of really complicated reciprocal easement agreements that were laid down by folks like Macy's and JCPenney to protect the parking available to their major anchor in the Christmas week. I mean, that's what they exist. So if you look at a map of a shopping center, you'll see it. If it was an X-ray, you would see a crisscross of reciprocal easement agreements that don't let those parking lots be used for anything but parking. They were to protect anchors that no longer deserve that protection. So we have to find a way in terms of planning to expedite planning for these centers by finding a public purpose way to eliminate these reciprocal easement agreements, because they no longer really serve a purpose other than value to its sort of extinguishing property owner, like a Macy's or a JCPenney. And I really don't want to speak ill of those companies. I think they're great companies, but they entrap these centers because they have done only what they needed to do 40 years ago, and that was protect their parking. Today, it's a different equation. So we have to fix these things as we go forward. But to me, these are better fixes than, let's say, SB 50, which unilaterally starts to impose density everywhere. I'm not against the density. It's just I represent so many communities that can't swallow that pill. Yet, you know, the communities that have a center that was once the epitome of sales tax vitality for that community and was the largest generator of taxes, which is now nothing but a series of parking lots that are mostly empty, and even worse now in a post-COVID world, they are going to be much more open, to the extent that we can facilitate planning, to redoing and revitalizing those centers, just like Laguna Hills is. So we just have to put these tools together. But I can give you lots of examples of planning that's going on up and down the state for the retooling of shopping centers to include residential and other uses.
Well, thanks very much. That concludes the questions that we've got. I would recommend folks who want to dive deeper on this to reach out to Larry and Joe. They indeed are experts on so much when it comes to public financing and have worked extensively with SCAG for many years and served us very well. So if you guys have questions, please do reach out to them. You can also reach out to SCAG staff. And thank you everyone for taking the time to join us today. We look forward to having you guys participate in, if you want to hear more, in a webinar that we have actually coming up on Tuesday of next week. Additional information is on our website. This is the Toolbox Tuesday, where we'll dive into a little bit deeper on this issue of the financing strategies to deal with the new paradigm of the pandemic. So again, thank you to Joe and Larry, and thank you everyone for joining us here today.